The warm summer in the city brought not only endless hours of sunshine but also a specific tension that could be felt in every corner. Lara is a young dark-skinned woman who stands at the stop and watches the roads with her big eyes. Her blue dress was simple and elegant, it did not draw too much attention, yet it never concealed her natural dignity. She was serene, as if, finally, after all these years, she found some interior peace. The streets were noisily buzzing all around, but to Lara, that was just background. Standing at the bus stop and sending her thoughts far from all that ordinary, plunging into some quiet life contemplation. But on that day, something was out of place. She heard a sound of approaching cars. Lara looked up to see a black patrol car crawling down the street. Behind the wheel sat Sergeant James Hauser, a police officer with a reputation for brutality and aversion to anything that wandered into his world. His white eyes seemed cold, unmerciful, and when people were under his gaze, they shrank into insignificance. He was a typical representative of the old school, where overt aggression towards outsiders seemed quite all right. At that moment, when the patrol car stopped right by the bus stop, Lara felt her heart race. She couldn't explain why, but her instincts told her that something was wrong. And indeed, not a second had passed when Hauser got out of the car and, with a step reminiscent of molten metal on an anvil, headed towards her. "What are you doing here?" His voice was not more powerful, yet an invisible strength was carried through because such a question had said a lot in the category of everything in control. In actual terms, it was rather meant to be an unassuming order for Lara: do know your role, be prepared. Of course, he never expects answers, even from himself. Lara shrugged and did not take her eyes off him. She didn't rush to respond, but stood and looked at him with an expressionless face. In her eyes, there was just calm, perhaps for him a challenge. "Excuse me, but what do you need?" After a little pause, she uttered, her voice still soft, yet distinct, without a trace of fear, just a dash of distrust. Hauser clearly paused for a moment, as if he didn't expect such calm in her response. He was apparently not used to anyone asking him questions. But he then composed himself. He wasn't going to back down. "Do you know who I am?" "I've dealt with people like you before," he said firmly, even menacingly. He did not even try to conceal that his gaze was contemptuous, sliding over Lara's clothes, onto her dark skin, and all gestures showed that you was unnecessary. Lara again did not hasten to respond. She couldn't understand for what reason he had chosen her, why he had decided to detain her specifically of all those standing at this crowded stop. Some internal voice whispered that this man just needed a pretext to humiliate someone. "I'm just waiting for the bus." "What do you need?" Her words sounded calm, even somewhat indifferent, but there was something in her tone that provoked an inner protest in Hauser. But he did not give up. Retreating was impossible. Hauser, without further ado, drew his gun, removed the handcuffs from his belt, and began to approach Lara. "I said, come to me." His voice turned into a command, an order that no longer allowed for choice. Lara froze for a moment, but then, almost immediately, she took a few steps back. Her legs were steady, her back straight, and this gave her strength in this difficult situation. She stood like a steadfast rock, ready to face the storm. "Do you think this is the right decision?" She still remained cool. She could have run away, she could have cried, or she could have started screaming, but Lara remained dignified. She knew this was no longer about her anymore. This was the moment when the real face of this man would come out. Hauser clenched his teeth. He didn't like situations where he had to use force on the rebellious, yet he did it, convincing himself that it was his duty. "You leave me no choice." He reached out and grabbed Lara by the wrist. He squeezed her hand so hard that she felt pain, but she didn't even flinch. And then something happened that was probably unplanned by either of them. Lara didn't take her eyes off him and suddenly did something he wasn't expecting. She stepped forward and, without any warning, attempted to push him. Hauser lost his balance, which was all it took. He seemed not to even realize what was happening, and then his feet got tangled in a trash bag lying nearby. A few seconds, which seemed to last an eternity, he tried to get up, but the fall onto the asphalt was yet another self-satisfactory act that further diminished his authority. The crowd that had started gathering around couldn't hold themselves back. First, a few people looked with interest, then one laughed, and the rest joined in. In each of these laughs, there was more than just humor. It was something akin to a feeling of justice that finally started to raise its voice in this place. Lara did not react to the situation and smiled. She did not feel like a winner. She felt only the bitterness of what had to happen for this man to understand that not everything is under his control. She moved on. "Don't you think you have other problems now?" she said, already at a safe distance, not looking back. Hauser lay on the asphalt, with a rope stuck in his boots, and the whole world seemed to him like some comedy he couldn't understand. The scorching sun was baking the asphalt, from which there rose fragrant steam and was inhaled in heavy gulps, mixing with the exhaust fumes of cars and the noise of city life. The streets were crowded, the air thick with energy and an almost palpable sense of tension. But Lara, young and dark-skinned, was an island in the chaos, standing on the sidewalk and almost oblivious to the surrounding world. Not hurrying, Lara looked into the distance, as if she were part of something greater, invisible, that lay beyond this dirty hustle and bustle. She was waiting for her bus, and while her face was a mask of serenity, her eyes betrayed a glint of a hard inner core that would not break. The black dress that fit her figure made her more graceful and elegantly proud than any display of false humility. She was part of the city, yet never from it. Lara didn't fuss over trivia, she had her place in this world, and that was sufficient. Crowds thronged the street, from the suit-garbed businessmen down to the camera-clicking tourists. And then from these comes a certain noise rather undecipherable, hawkers screaming their wares, clanging music coming from each opened cafe, and at some point, a barking dog that races by everybody, running to the end of somebody's leg. They meant nothing to Lara, not until the appearance of that black patrol car. A braking sound cut through the air, and Lara, without removing her gaze from the horizon, felt her inner compass quiver for a moment. It was strange, like the premonition of a storm. All those sounds that just a second ago sounded like the usual background of the city became part of this moment when she noticed a patrol car slowly approaching her. And there it stayed, right next to her. Lara looked up to see a face that was indeed familiar but not particularly appealing. It was Sergeant James Hauser, the police officer about whom rumors were already flying in the district. He didn't just enforce the law, he was a living symbol of harsh, brutal authority. White, middle-aged, with tired eyes and tightly pressed lips, Hauser seemed not so much a person but a part of this brutal world. His suit was impeccably pressed as if he perfectly fitted his role of a guardian of order, while in reality, he was a police officer whose task was to uphold not order but his own authoritative position. Immediately as the car door opened, Lara's body went a little tight. She knew this was a point of reckoning. She didn't even need to say anything because her being there was enough to get under his skin. Of course, she was absolutely right. "What are you doing here?" His tone was cutting and inflexible, he didn't want to know the answer he needed just to exert an authority. Lara raised an eyebrow, without speaking to him or searching in his words for at least some sense. Instead, her gaze was quiet and her eyes cold with calculation. "I'm waiting for the bus." "What do you need?" It wasn't aggression, just a simple question to which, as she knew, he had no answer. Hauser was like a predatory bird watching its prey. His gaze was piercing, and every movement he made was precise and confident. He was used to people simply obeying his orders. But Lara was not one of those who simply give in. "You don't know who I am?" he said, taking a step closer. His face descended toward her, and already Lara could feel his anger with every word. His eyes were filled with disdain, as if he was sure it wasn't even worth his time to speak. Lara looked at him with the same indifference as if he were just another passerby on the street. "Excuse me, Sergeant, I didn't understand. Do you have the official right to ask me what I'm doing on the street?" Her voice was calm, with an ironical tint that the policeman obviously didn't like. Having finally realized that her response was not giving him grounds for continuing the conversation, he chose to act. In so doing, he suddenly, and unannounced, reached for Lara's hand, something that caused her pain around the wrist area. "I don't like it if someone questions me, sweetheart. You are coming with me." His voice heavy and rough, speaking like some kind of dictator who will put up with no refusal. Lara was not caught off guard and did not even struggle. Her body did not show any trace of panic, and from all appearances, she had it well in hand. She didn't scream or run away either. Instead, her gaze stayed smooth, almost piercing, as though she had already viewed this scene to its final acts. And here raced the point where something really wasn't expected to happen. Hauser leaned closer, trying to pull her towards him. And at that moment, Lara, who was facing him, suddenly turned around, sharply elbowing him in the chest. All his calculations that he could keep her under control instantly failed. In the next second, he was already tangled in the nearby garbage bag and fell onto the asphalt, sliding across it. He forgets all his plans and tries to get up, but the rope hanging from the container gets tangled around his legs. All this time, Lara remained still, standing with an expression on her face that could be called a barely noticeable smile. She was once again at a safe distance. Meanwhile, the audience started noticing the developments. First, there were first glances, then phones appeared one after another, and a few women quietly hissed aside, "God damn, just look at him." Someone in the crowd couldn't resist and burst out laughing. And in a few seconds, the laughter was so loud it merged into a real explosion. Hauser, who tried to wriggle himself free, looked not just incompetent but ridiculous. His body got even heavier as he tried to break free from the ropes, and Lara's gaze, so calm and indifferent, seemed an ironic confirmation that this man never knew what it was like to be him. Lara didn't stop. She continued walking, her footsteps confident and rhythmic, just as if nothing had happened. All of her was so peaceful that even the wind rustling down the street seemed quiet, modest, compared to an inner strength kindling within. At that moment, nothing in her life seemed different. For her, it was just another event that confirmed the fact that many people in the world do not understand what being worthy is. Completely unexpectedly, Hauser found himself on the ground, laughed at by the crowd. But he was not just embarrassed, he was humiliated. And with each second that had passed, while trying to get his legs out of the ropes and the garbage bag, he got angrier and angrier. If looks could kill, Lara would have been dead long ago. But she paid no attention to his desperate attempts. For her, there was only one thing that mattered: everything was going according to plan. Her plan. But for Hauser, it was a real blow to his pride. In his world, there was no place for failures. He was a man who was not accustomed to defeats, not accustomed to seeing himself as ridiculous. And here his brute strength, his display of dominance that was meant to intimidate others, turned into a comical scene. Dirt, trash stuck to his uniform, a rope tangled in his shoes, all of it made him look like a fool, and worse still, he knew many people had seen it. People in the audience were laughing around her. At first, Lara couldn't hear the laughter, however, she could feel its importance. The thing that was that crucial for them was equally crucial as an event important to her. For them, it was a certain moment of truth that allowed them to experience a genuine feeling of their freedom. Hauser, putting himself together to regain his self-respect, sprang to his feet and, though defeated, began to look every bit like a confident man. He dusted his face, yet he remained in his police uniform, which did not have any resemblance to what it had been. His eyes became full of anger. "You will pay for this," he growled menacingly, gritting his teeth. His voice sounded like an oath he issued despite the absurdity of the situation. Now he was on the edge. His self-esteem was in tatters, and he longed to restore it. Lara did not say anything more. She was already very far away. She only walked, yet in her heart, there was some pleasing feeling. She knew he was sure to meet her again, and then he could do nothing to his liking this time. With a few more women left, unable to hold themselves back from laughing, Lara took a gentle walk towards the nearest cafe. Her eyes remained in a focused gaze, while even though this situation was, apparently, over, each of her steps felt a part of something much larger. It seemed like the real battle was still not over. This had been just the start of it. Police station. While Lara went calmly to the cafe, Hauser was not going to let it be so easy. He couldn't let such a thing go unpunished. He couldn't understand why he was being so humiliated, and more than that, why nobody helped him up when he fell. All those laughs and glances at him were a challenge for him, and now he was ready to take any action for getting his power and authority back. Hauser picked up the phone in the patrol car and called the police station. "I need help. Detain her. Understood?" His voice sounded aggressive. He was ready to punish the woman who had disrupted the order. He waited for an answer, but in his head, a hurricane was brewing. Doubts were breaking through him, but he knew well that if he gave in now, that would be a disaster for him. In his mind, all kinds of revenge plans were beginning to emerge. He could turn to his colleagues, feign the situation to be more complicated than it was, and by doing so, get his position back. Yes, I know who it was. It was the same woman who keeps breaking the rules over and over again. She should be in place, in the isolation ward. Take her away. He said a few seconds later, after confirming that he knew Lara's whereabouts. But something in his voice sounded less convincing. Maybe it was because he could not look so confident this time. Or maybe it was that particular moment when all his strength got lost. Indeed, even on the other side of the line, his colleagues sensed that moment of uncertainty. Among them was Senior Inspector Martinson, who looked at the monitor, surprised. "What do you want to do?" "I don't see any serious violations on her part. It doesn't look like an emergency, Hauser. Maybe it's not worth it after all." These words were another blow to his confidence. But Hauser didn't give up. He simply clicked the receiver and frowned. Internally, he decided, if the department doesn't help him, he will do it himself. He came to the conclusion that he needed to take action. If his power and authority were to remain, he had to take immediate and decisive action. He checked his gun, stood from the table, and began to head out of the precinct. This was among many ideas he had in his mind, but he didn't want Lara to have any chance of winning at that moment. Lara sat in a cozy cafe, where everything was just calm and cozy. She ordered her usual espresso and peered out the window, watching the city's traffic. Her heart was beating calmly, unhurried, and all around, it seemed to look like a very ordinary scene. But this was that calm before the storm. A feeling of something big about to happen was already in the air. She knew Hauser wasn't going to cool down. And when the door to the cafe opened, she looked up to see a familiar police officer enter the premises. There was a determination in his eyes and a confident, abrupt way of moving. "We are still not done, Laro." His voice sounded harsh, and it was clear that he was ready for brutal actions. But this time, Lara was ready. The cafe was small and cozy, with dim light streaming through the windows, making the atmosphere look somewhat mystical. Lara sat by the window, her gaze not directed at the street, yet she still felt the surrounding world pulsating. The city didn't stop. It was alive, ringing, ready for change. And though she didn't believe that changes would come through her alone, her presence was part of something bigger. A cup of hot espresso rubbed off the chill of the night that was still running in her veins after the excitement. But her heart was at ease. She knew that Hauser would return. Another warning from life. And this was what she had been waiting for, albeit not in this way. It was not a chance meeting, it was part of how she lived, how she fought. She was ready. Her eyes clouded as the cafe doors opened. They didn't open due to the usual gusty draft, but through a deliberate movement, like a storm breaching a calm harbor. Lara did not turn her head. She already knew who it was. "Not so fast, Lara." A hoarse, unwelcoming voice slashed the silence. It was Sergeant Hauser. His legs, apart, and tense shoulders said it all about the simmering aggression. Lara lifted her gaze calmly. There was no change in her face. No panicking, no unnecessary gestures. Still as a statue, unwavering in their composure. And this is her strength, being with the moment without allowing the waves around to take away the balance. Hauser, not to be outdone, swaggered over to the table at which Lara was seated and laid his hand on it, as if pressing down an unseen catch. His eyes smoldered with anger, his mind racing with just one thing: to break her. "You have no idea whom you're messing with. The last mistake you will ever do is this." And all his words were heavy, as so was each of his steps. In his body, everything screamed control, and yet in his eyes, there had been fear. And she knew it. Lara didn't react to his aggressiveness. Her gaze was fixed, she was merely observing him. She knew her silence was her weapon. She need not win through physical strength or cunningness. She won through calm and patience. Hauser was reaching the edge, and now he only had to take his final step. In that moment, he was caught in the web of his own pride. Their eyes locked, and Lara, without softening the intensity, said in a quiet tone, "You still don't understand why I'm not afraid." Her words sounded like an incantation. They weren't too loud or aggressive, but they had immense strength. Hauser faltered for a moment. What was that? Lara's gaze? Her calm? His mind wrestled with those questions, but he couldn't find any answers. "Why aren't you answering? Aren't you afraid?" His voice turned sharper, and he started approaching her, trying to get his controlled aggression back. But Lara didn't even raise a hand to step backward. Her silence was far stronger than his words. Then Hauser, unable to bear this complete indifference towards himself, leaned over the table, touching her espresso cup. It was emotional, but it didn't really change anything. He felt the nerves beginning to crush his mind. He was on the verge. "You need to understand who I am." His voice was more of a shout than a firm statement. Lara raised her gaze, and that turned out to be so powerful a look that Hauser felt his legs begin to tremble. He started to falter. "I know who you are, Sergeant Hauser." Her voice was low, calm, without a hint of fear. "I know what you need to be strong. But you will never understand true strength. That's why you fell today." These words felt like a shot to his inner world. He didn't want to admit it, but precisely like that, it indeed was. His strength was an illusion. His strength was not more than a thin fragile crust, cracking at the seams, beneath which lay only an empty void, part of his uncertainty. He felt this, and he could not resist it anymore. His emotions went wild. His hands started to shake, his breathing got heavy. He took a few steps back, still trying to look like a confident man, but his face changed. His eyes showed an incredible disappointment. You don't know who you're dealing with." It was no longer just a statement, but a plea. A plea to break her, to prove his strength, even though inside, his world was gradually beginning to crumble. He did not even admit to himself that Lara had already defeated him. She needed neither a word nor a gesture anymore. She showed him that true strength is not aggression and not control. True strength was in the ability to remain calm and fearless even when someone is trying to break you. Hauser froze in place. He couldn't take a single step forward or utter a word that could change this moment. Lara looked at him once more, but said nothing more. She knew that everything was already decided. "You can go, Sergeant. You have already lost." With these words, Lara stood up, leaving behind the man who just a few moments ago considered himself invincible. He stood exhausted, watching her calm exit. And this time he couldn't stop her. Instead, he had to stay in his defeat, which seemed to be his last lesson. The morning fog was gradually building on the streets. Lara walked slowly, her heart calm, but inside, still raging with the emotions that had taken place. She didn't think Hauser would be so weak. But she already understood not everyone is capable of facing the truth that they will entangle themselves in their own illusions of strength. It reminded her of just how many are out there like Hauser, the ones who live in the terrors of their souls, afraid to stand up against their own weaknesses. The ones who tell themselves that they are justified in tearing down others so they can make themselves not feel so wrong. He stood wordlessly before her, in confusion and brokenness, like all those who chose aggression as a way to mask their complexes. Meanwhile, Hauser sat in his car, playing back in his mind those moments that a few hours earlier had seemed so crucial and right. The laughter he heard directed at him, the astonishment reflected in people's eyes when he tried to take control of the situation, now seemed humiliating to him. He couldn't understand how she could look so calm. How was this possible? How could this woman, who had no weight in his world, win this game so easily? Hauser's hands were tight on the wheel, shaking with tension. He took deep breaths, long and slow, trying to get his confidence back. He had to find it. He had to restore his name. And she, this Lara, was a threat. A threat that would bring down everything he had built his whole life. Police station. Before he knew it, Hauser was down at the police station, where Martinson, a senior inspector, greeted him, unable to understand why the sergeant was so stubbornly trying to force his version of the situation on them. "Hauser, don't you think you've gone a bit overboard? What was that show in the cafe?" Martinson looked at him, pursing his lips. "She didn't answer you? Is this disrespect towards a police officer, or did you just not handle the stress?" Hauser remained silent, then clenched his teeth again. "I will never allow that to happen, Martinson. You don't understand, it is she who always thinks she's better than all of us. And she is the one who is going to be shown one does not question someone like me. And I won't be rubbish, as she believes I am." His voice spoke volumes of anger, bottled within him. Martinson did look at him with some sense of pity but managed to show doubts clearly in his face. "You're taking this too seriously. This already appears to be personal issues, not work. I'd advise you to keep that situation under control before it goes further." Martinson spoke with reason in his voice and laid a hand on the shoulder of Hauser as if to pull him from a ledge. But already Hauser was in another world. The department might not understand it, but he couldn't stop. To him, this woman, her coolness, her lack of fear, became a personal affront. He had to turn everything back. Lara on the way. Lara was not like everybody else. She didn't go home, didn't hide. She wasn't running from problems, contrarily, every step she made brought her closer to them. She knew this battle was not yet over. She walked through the park, past the yellow and red leaves that fell off the trees. This world was so peaceful, so far from everything she had gone through within the last hours. On one hand, doubts troubled her. Had she done the right thing, leaving him like that? Was it right to leave him a humiliated person, not allowing him to get to the very essence of his fear? She was not cruel, no. Her calmness, her indifference, that was the response to everything she saw in Hauser. It was not in trying to humiliate her, as it was in not even understanding why he did it. He was weak. But she did not care what was going to happen next. She had already experienced more than one such moment when those in power tried to destroy everything that did not meet their standards. She knew for sure that to Hauser her life didn't matter, but it mattered to all those who felt equally oppressed. A heavy unease settled in her heart. She could foresee that Hauser would not back down. And she was ready. She was not naive. He knew that when cruelty and aggression turn into a personal mission, no one can be safe. The return of Hauser. It was when he found his pride and controlling instincts were of no use that old methods came to Hauser's mind. He called some of his colleagues who had connections in the local media and asked them to find ways to compromise Lara. He did not seek just punishment but wanted everyone to see her as an enemy of society, that she shouldn't be free. But Lara already knew this would be his last attempt. And this time she was ready.